The Economic Club of Minnesota's mission is to provide a world-class, nonpartisan forum for national and international leaders in business and public policy to discuss ideas that affect how Minnesota can better compete in the global economy. The Economic Club of Minnesota, engaging the world, strengthening Minnesota.
We're very pleased to have Timothy Beardson as our speaker today. As Tim mentioned, he has a 35-year look, living in Hong Kong, actively engaged in China. So not just the last 5, 10, 20 years that many people have started to turn their attention to Asia, but a much longer look. His credentials include being the only Western bank involved as they set up the Shanghai Stock Exchange, as well as the first investment bank in China. But he also is looking at things not just in his new book, Stumbling Giant, from the business perspective or from the political perspective, but also both of those together with social, environmental, and many other aspects put together. He brings what is perhaps a counterintuitive view as to what the future of China is, not decidedly negative, but with some caution for the future. And he also, you'll see little brochures at your table on China Outlook, is happy to continue to keep you apprised as to what his view is on the continuing evolution of the future of China. So without further ado, please welcome Timothy Beardson.
Mark, thank you very much indeed for that very kind introduction. The rise of China is the most read topic in the print media or on the internet over the last 14 years, apparently, according to the people that measure these kinds of things. And yet, surprisingly, the literature, the books on this subject, are not very many. Probably fewer than 20 books around in English on where China's going to go in the long term and why. And the literature tends to fall into, I guess, two extremes. Books like When China Rules the World and titles like The Coming Collapse of China. 90% of the literature takes the positive view that China is going to eventually replace the United States and become the next global superpower. What I've done is to say, well, we know that we've had 3 decades now of reported growth in the region of 10% a year, but it would be interesting to try to look at where China's going to go the next few decades. So I try to look at all the drivers of a country's future. As Mark said, I've looked at the economy and politics, but I've also tried to look at language, at culture, the environment, education, technology, relationships with foreign countries, relationships with the neighbors. I've tried to create an integrated look at the future of the country. And that's why the book's a little bit on the large size. But for me, there are some very large-scale challenges coming. And the biggest of those is a challenge which isn't susceptible to any quick fixes. It's the issue of demography. And by its nature, demography is a very long-term thing that you just can't fix. So the demographic challenge comes in 4 different shapes. Firstly, the workforce of China, which for many years was growing abundantly, and as a result, we even had a 12-year period when wages didn't change at all. And China became the cheapest place in the world to make almost everything. That's now changing. From the early 70s to now, the number of births every year in China has fallen by 40%. So that's coming through, as you'd expect now, to the labor force. And in anticipation, and as a result of that, we've seen double-digit growth in wages now for some years, and that's going to continue because the results of that reduction in birth rate are going to continue. So the Chinese labor force is going to get smaller and smaller. That means that China really has to look for a different economic model. It's got to start becoming more of an innovation-driven economy. It's got to have a higher high-tech component. And this is government policy and has been for several years, but unfortunately, there's very little sign of that taking place. So for me, that's the first demographic challenge. The second is that China is increasingly an aging society. At the moment, there are 100 million Chinese who are over 65. By 2030, that's going to be over 300 million. But the issue isn't a tripling of the elderly, because also what's happening is a change in the nature of the Chinese family. I mean, traditionally, families have looked after old people. That's been the way it works. Government doesn't get involved. But now, because of demographic changes within China, a typical working couple might expect to have 4 parents alive and maybe even 8 grandparents alive. And this is just changing the dependency ratio. This is changing the balance between the number of those who work and the number of those who have retired. At the moment, just over 1% of elderly in China are in any kind of institutional care. That's like 1 million people. But the capacity of Chinese families to look after the old is markedly reducing. And of course, they tend not to have siblings. So the full weight of the ever longer living elderly is coming down onto a very small number of working people. So I suggest by 2030, we might be looking at 50% of the elderly being in some kind of institutional care. So the requirement may be for government to take care not of 1 million like today, but maybe 150 million by 2030. And of course, China is a country with a surprisingly small budget, given the fact that it's the second largest economy in the world. I mean, in the United States, your budget is something over 30% of GDP. In Europe, it's 40 to 50% of GDP. In China, it's scarcely above 20%. So there are going to be some agonizing budgetary discussions in China in the coming years. Do we look after 150 million old people, or do we build 6 more aircraft carriers? So that's the second challenge. The third demographic challenge is that of gender disparity. China is a country with a rural heritage and a Confucian heritage. And in that kind of society, people prefer male children. And of course, people have been having fewer children. And in that context, they have taken steps to ensure that if they want them, that by and large they have male children. So over the last 20 years, China has had 6 boys born for every 5 girls. And that is the most extreme gender disparity of any country in the world, and probably at any time in history. But as a result, we now know that in the next 20 years, there are going to be something like 50 million men who will not get a wife. And this doesn't mean that 1 in 6 men will not get married, but of course, as you all know, women play quite an important part in any marriage decision. And sociologists like to tell us that women marry up. And what they mean is they tend to marry men who are more affluent, more intelligent, maybe even better looking. So what we can probably surmise is that 1 in 2.5 men 40% of men who are poorer, stupider, uglier, are not going to get a wife. And they're going to be thronging the cities. And this is already starting to have an impact on China's urban crime rates. These people are going to be angry. Eventually, it's going to have an effect on social stability in China. 50 million is not that different from the entire population of France. Thronging the Chinese cities, angry, inarticulate, unhappy. So that's the third challenge. But I think maybe the biggest demographic challenge for China is what's happening to the total population of the country. Because at the moment, it is slowly growing every year. But the Chinese family's average fertility rate is 1.7 children per couple. But replacement rate is about 2.1. So we can project, looking into the future, what is going to happen to the population of China. And every demographic estimate is that by the late 2020s, the population of China will peak at round about 1.4 billion people. Now, by the early 2020s, we're going to start to anticipate India becoming a bigger country than China, the most populous country in the world. That has a business impact because virtually every multinational company has a strategy for China, but a lot of them have no strategy for India. So as we move towards the 2020s, there's going to be more focus on India. Foreign investment flows into India are going to increase from the very low levels at the moment. Investment flows into China may show some degree of diminution. But as we move on through the late 2020s, after China's population peaks, all the forecasts are that it's going to start coming down. The debate then is by how much. The most benign forecast for the long-term outlook for China's population is that of the United Nations. It tends to be very influenced by what its member governments represent. Their forecast is that China's population by 2100 will have fallen by 1/3, by 450 million people. The more robust, independent forecasts by academics are for falls of anywhere up to 2/3 in the population of China, bringing it possibly down to about 500 million people by the end of this century, which is roughly where people project the United States population will have risen to. So there's an interesting strategic implication here that at the moment there are 4.5 Chinese for every 1 citizen of America. By the end of this century, it could be 1 to 1. But I think the most important impact from this trend is that I can't think of any society in history which has had continually falling population and at the same time has been able to sustain continued high rates of economic growth. I can't think of anybody who's done it. So what that suggests is by the time we move into the 2030s, 15 years from now, we'll probably be saying that China will have done pretty well if it achieves an annual economic growth rate of 2%. So the world's going to look a little bit different as we move along from here to there. And when China looks the other challenges that it has in front of it, whether it's cleaning up the environment, whether it's trying to build an innovative education system or a functional financial system, it really needs to address those much needed areas while it still has decent levels of economic growth, while it can fund the changes it needs to create. Because it's going to be a lot harder in 10 years' time to be dealing with some of those issues. So I think that there's a call for urgency amongst policymakers in China, which we simply have not been seeing. I mean, China in the 1980s and 1990s was the fastest reforming country in the world. But from the year 2000 until now, you could scarcely point to a reform. And of course, the reforms that China does need to undertake increasingly come with some political cost to the government. And so they become harder to tackle. So we need China to show some urgency to engage with things that won't be comfortable or easy to engage with. So it's going to be a tough time for the people who are running China. I might just talk about one or two, depending on the time, of the other challenges that China has, which are all soluble if there is the will to tackle them. The financial system, to me, appears very dysfunctional in China. And I'll give three examples of that. One is foreign exchange reserves. People look at China and say, $3.5 trillion of foreign exchange reserves. This is fantastic. They could buy Citibank, or they could rescue the Western banking system. But it's not quite like that. They overlook how a country like China creates its foreign exchange reserves. It creates them through two different mechanisms. One is that Chinese companies export more than they import, and therefore accumulate foreign exchange, which they then have to sell to the central bank for domestic currency. The other means is that the Chinese government, like many governments around the world, intervenes daily in the foreign exchange markets to stabilize its currency, or as Washington might say, manipulate its currency. And that generally means that they're selling Chinese currency into the foreign exchange markets and buying foreign currency, principally dollars. So at the end of every year, China's foreign exchange reserves get bigger and bigger. But at every step along the way, it has cost them in their currency to get there. And China didn't have 3 trillion of its own currency 30 years ago. Where's it got it from? It hasn't printed the money. What has happened is that it's raised that money through two different ways. One is that it issues bonds to insurance companies, to banks, to savers, domestic currency bonds, and it pays interest on them. The other is that it asks all the banks that operate in China to place prudential reserves with the central bank in proportion to the size of their balance sheet, like many other countries do. So it effectively borrows money from the banking system. It borrows money from savers. It pays interest, and it uses that domestic money to acquire foreign assets. So we can pretty much say, although the numbers aren't published, that China may have $3.5 trillion of foreign exchange, but it has something approaching $3 trillion of domestic currency liabilities. And of course, the Chinese currency has been rising since 2005. And every 10% increase in the Chinese currency is a $300 billion loss to China on its foreign exchange reserves. The interest it gets on US treasuries is a lot less than the interest it pays on the debt it has at home. The estimate is that it loses $66 billion a year on the mismatch. So I wouldn't argue that China is in a position of enormous strength because of its foreign exchange reserves, I would argue that it's in a very vulnerable position. You could even say, if you want to be colourful, that China increasingly resembles the largest, highly leveraged and undiversified currency hedge fund in the world. The other two examples of a dysfunctional financial system are that, as we know, China's reported 10% economic growth for 30 years. But the private sector in 1980 was 3% of the economy. It's now estimated to be 65% of the economy. So you can calculate that the private sector has grown by over 20% a year for 30 years. But over 60% of bank loans go to state enterprises, not to private companies. The rest of bank loans go to local government, multinationals. Probably fewer than 10% of all the loans go to the private sector. Therefore, private sector business people are borrowing from relatives, they're borrowing from loan sharks, or they're not borrowing at all. They're using retained profit to finance the next stage of their expansion. This is not optimizing China's potential for growth. If the most vibrant part of the economy is unable to access bank credit in any normal way. The third example is the stock market. Now, if a country reports 10% growth for 30 years, it's not surprising if investors around the world say, well, I'd like to have a piece of that economy. How do I get into China? And people have been buying Chinese shares, Chinese mutual funds, and they may be surprised that this week the Chinese Stock Exchange closes at the same level it was at 12 years ago. The stock market has simply not reflected the reported growth of the economy in any way whatever. And the reason for that is that over 85% of the value of the Chinese stock market is state enterprises, not the private sector. So the part that's been growing the fastest is the part that finds it very hard to access the capital markets. So there are many things that China could do in a different way, which I suggest would improve its capacity to grow. Some of China's policies and functions seem almost calculated to minimize the potential for growth. How are we doing for time, Mark?
Just a couple more minutes.
Couple more, right. Maybe if I touch on education and innovation, why China is showing very little sign of success in those areas. The Chinese government has definitely had a policy for at least 15 years to try and drive innovation. They set targets like what percentage of GDP they want to see spent on research and development. Generally, those targets are undershot. And when you look at who's spending the money, the first answer is, well, 70% of it is business. And you think, well, that makes sense because that's what we see in the United States. But then when you try and break it down into categories, you find out that most of it is really state enterprises conducting projects that the government has mandated, but don't necessarily have any commercial application. The private sector is probably spending less than 10% of what China spends on R&D. Foreign multinationals are in this list. Probably they account for something like 16 to 20% of R&D in China. And as we know, foreign multinationals are very sensitive to intellectual property rights and don't particularly want their research to trickle down through the Chinese economy and raise the general technological level. It's the research that they're doing there is for very specific purposes for their benefit, quite understandably. So actually, it's the wrong people spending money, and it's not surprising that the commercial application of that research is not particularly effective for developing China's economy. The government will set targets in areas like patent grant applications, but not really in terms of patent grants. And that, of course, patent applications have gone hugely upwards. But even when you look at those that are granted, too many of them are utility patents, not invention patents. And when you look at the invention patents, a lot of them have limited commercial application. So we're not seeing China really show great signs of innovation. And we might say that's not necessarily a problem of being Chinese, because in Silicon Valley there are many examples of very successful innovators who are ethnically Chinese. But there are institutional constraints within China. And one of the biggest is probably the education system. But I think I've probably used up my time. I haven't talked about foreign affairs, military, all sorts of issues that may be of interest. I'm very happy to answer anything that people would like to ask. Thank you.
We do have roughly 10, 15 minutes for Q&A. I'm going to kick this off while the microphones start circulating in the room. Your last comments just a moment ago spark a question that may be on the minds of some in the room. As you look to foreign investment in China, what are the greatest opportunities in the near term? And you already began to list some of the challenges, but what are the challenges that these firms would also face?
Well, China is a country that has an extraordinarily thin social security provision. I mean, for example, government spending on healthcare as a proportion of the economy is lower than it was in the United States under President George W. Bush. China, in many respects, makes America look like a socialist country. China has very limited unemployment arrangements, very limited pension arrangements. In fact, the state pension funds are regarded as being virtually bankrupt. The liabilities outweigh the assets. So this is a country where social provision is needed. There are a lot of poor people, a lot of unemployed people who can never work in a modern economy at all. Were it to be opened up, there would be enormous opportunities for people that provide pensions or healthcare or all sorts of things, which I think could be provided more efficiently by people who have the experience of doing this in other economies than is currently done in China. Another area is tourism, which I think is capable of growing enormously in China, but it isn't necessarily carried out very well. The attention to quality is not good. The ability to market is not very good in China. People aren't taught a lot of those soft service-related skills that you really need to be in business. I think there are a lot of opportunities to do business in China, and it doesn't really matter where it grows from here because it's already a large place.
And then related to that, import and export trends as you see them within China, where are we most likely to see greater opportunities for importation of goods, services, and then where is the trend going to be on the kinds of exports that we can see coming out of China based on your analysis?
Well, it's perhaps a little difficult to discuss all the different industries, but what I think we should anticipate is that China is likely to evolve more into services than manufacturing in the future. And that has an implication for its purchase of raw materials. I think people have got into the habit of saying, well, if we can forecast the Chinese economy, we can forecast their use of energy, their use of coal or steel. But actually, China is a very inefficient user of many commodities, particularly oil and water, coal. I mean, it uses 9 times as much energy as Japan to produce the same unit of output. So what we could see is that China could grow, but also at the same time become more efficient and not necessarily increase its use of energy. So there are likely to be changes within the patterns that we can see.
I'm looking for a hand up. You got one? Otherwise, I've got another question. Tom, identify yourself.
What do you see as China's trying to get more influence in the South China Sea?
Well, China has a rather introverted idea of its historic geography. If Chinese fishermen had a habit of sailing through some islands 1,000 years ago, that doesn't mean that nobody else's fishermen sail through those same islands. It doesn't mean they're necessarily integrally a part of China on any logical argument. But these are the sorts of arguments we're hearing. But I think that rather than focus on rocky islands in East Asia, it might be interesting to say China has 20 neighbors by land or by sea, and it has disagreements with 14 of them at least. And the one that has the largest implication, I think, is that China is so desperately short of water. I mean, North China has been described as the largest piece of contiguous water-short land in the world. And this is partly because it has aggressively overused its aquifers to the point that many of them are terminally depleted. And so China's solution to this is that because it occupies the Tibetan Plateau, where 7 of the world's largest rivers arise, it is going to divert some of that water, which at the moment flows through Russia to the Arctic, through Southeast Asia to Vietnam, the Mekong, through India and Bangladesh, the Brahmaputra, through Burma, the Salween, and so on. So to divert that water through canals and channels that it's currently engineering across China from the southwest to the very dry northeast, this is causing, as you might anticipate, a lot of China's neighbors to be deeply concerned, because even small fluctuations in water level have a huge ecological impact on downstream societies. Something like 1/3 to 40% of the world drinks water that arises on the Tibetan Plateau. So China's current course of action is setting it on something of a collision path. And the fact that it doesn't really believe in negotiation or discussion, it simply believes in this context in action, there is the capacity for something to go wrong. And yet, when you consider that the largest use of water in China is agriculture, that uses 70% of all the water, and in agriculture, 55% of the water does not get to the point of use. It's lost along the way. That constitutes over 1/3 of the entire water in the system every year in China. I would suggest that it would be better for China to focus on water conservation than on diverting water from its neighbors.
We have a question over here.
Hi, right before the Q&A session, it sounded like you were going to start making some interesting comments about the education system in China, and I was hoping you could continue with some of those.
Okay. The university entrance examination is a nationwide exam in China. It's called the Gaokao. And this is not an examination that asks people to think. It doesn't say, blue, what do you think? It says, question 27, what is the answer to this? And you learn the answers to all the questions that might come up. And there is only one answer. This is learning data. It's not learning critical thinking. And I would suggest that that requires the whole secondary system of China to be geared to this process of learning, because all those students want to go to university. And it gears the sort of student that you get at university to being people who are good at learning data, not learning critical thinking. I think this is very unfortunate for China if it wants to become an innovative society. China in the 1990s had 600,000 graduates a year. It now has 7 million. The last 8 years, China has built a new university every 3 days. It may not surprise us that, we'll leave aside the official statistics, but graduate unemployment is in the region of 45%. In Portugal, it's 38%. In Taiwan, it's 20%. In Britain, it's 10%. China probably has the most extreme graduate unemployment in the world. It produces graduates that employers don't seem to want. Chinese employers or Western employers. McKinsey did a survey that said 85% of all Chinese graduates cannot work in any international context. It may explain why the average graduate salary for those who get a job is less than the average migrant laborer's salary in China. So I would suggest that the university system and the education system in general are not doing the job that China should want it to be doing. And we need radical change in the underlying assumptions of what we're trying to produce. Now, perhaps what we need to do is to close half of China's universities, cut by half the number of graduates that are produced, and then invest a lot more money in those universities that remain open, and go for quality, not for quantity. But I think there are a lot of things that could and should be done in China, but a lot of this explains why innovation is very weak.
As we always try to keep this on schedule in deference to your busy schedules, we have time for just one final question.
Just to follow up, as far as, do you see anything developing in the Chinese leadership that is going to maybe address some of the reforms that are needed? And how do you see this playing out in China or in India as well? Any other quick thought there?
Well, we might say rather ironically that perhaps one of China's problems is that it isn't a dictatorship. I mean, President Xi can't wake up tomorrow morning and say, we really need to make some changes here. I'm going to do this, this, and this. He's got to carry so many people with him, not just 9 people in the Politburo Standing Committee, not just 25 people in the Politburo, but hundreds of people have a real say in where China's going, what its policies are going to be, and many of those have a vested interest economically in keeping things the way they are. So there's a lot of animosity towards reform, economic reform, let alone political reform. So it may prove impossible eventually for the government to make the reforms it needs to make, simply because the system proves too difficult. The Communist Party has been extremely adaptative through the 80s and 90s, but not recently. And if they could bring themselves to adapt yet again, they could buy many decades in government. But if they can't adapt, clean the environment, create a functional innovation culture, if they can't get the financial system right, I think there are going to be problems that will bring the system down.
Kind of a dour note for them. For them, I don't know what it's going to mean for the rest of us. This has been a content-heavy luncheon today, a lot of food for thought. I wish we could do more than offer you this paperweight. But it is our tradition to offer our guest speakers this paperweight and thank you for helping us kick off this 6th season of the Economic Club of Minnesota.
Thank you very much.
The Economic Club of Minnesota's mission is to provide a world-class, nonpartisan forum for national and international leaders in business and public policy to discuss ideas that affect how Minnesota can better compete in the global economy. The Economic Club of Minnesota, engaging the world, strengthening Minnesota.